I call the member for Burdekin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise today to speak to the Vegetation Management and Other Legislation Amendment Bill 2018. And can I say at the outset that the LNP will be opposing this bill. Furthermore, I will be proposing a number of common sense and practicable amendments during consideration in detail, which I will elaborate on in due course. Mr Deputy Speaker, there's a reason why 500 farmers protested outside this parliament earlier today. There's a reason why thousands of farmers around this state attended public hearings throughout Queensland conducted by the State Development, Natural Resources and Agricultural Industry Development Committee. And there is a reason why 17,500 people signed a petition protesting at the introduction of this bill, and that reason is anger. Anger that this Labor government is demonising our farmers and introducing the most draconian vegetation management laws this state has ever seen. This bill breaks all the rules of responsible governance and, by doing so, breaks the Labor Party's election commitment to govern for all Queenslanders, not just the people in Brisbane who voted for them. Let me say from the outset, this bill is not based on facts. It is built upon a rotting foundation of extreme green ideology, shonky science and an ugly manifestation of the city-country divide. It is the kind of bill that sums up the white-hot frustrations the electorate has with our political system, in placing their ascetical notions of perceived ethical action ahead of the very real and direct impact these laws have on people. To put simply, this is politics over people, and those opposite should hang their heads in shame that they are a party to it. These laws, Mr Speaker, have a very real impact on our Queensland farmers and the rural and regional communities they support. Unfortunately, the very people these laws will hit hardest were not given a seat at the table when these laws were written up. Agricultural groups and regional communities were not consulted before this bill was put before Parliament. Farmers and their communities had the door slammed in their faces, while green groups cosied up to this government to get the bill that they wanted. To use the Queensland Farmers Federation's own words, disappointingly, the government did not consult with the agricultural sector and key stakeholders before the 2016 bill was introduced, and nor has it done so before tabling the 2018 bill. Cane Growers CEO Dan Galligan said there has been no consultation on the bill. The advocacy group representing fruit and vegetable growers, GrowCom, said that it was deeply disappointed by the lack of consultation with the intensive agriculture sector during the development of this bill and its previous iterations. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill was introduced into Parliament on the 8th of March, with the committee required to report back to the Legislative Assembly by the 23rd of April 2018. That's right, 7 weeks to consider a bill that proposed the biggest changes to the agricultural sector in Queensland's history. Despite calls for a regulatory impact statement, a process that would have examined the environmental, social and economic impact these amendments would have on our farmers and local communities, the department decided in its infinite wisdom not to complete a RIS, wait for it, due to the need to avoid both panic clearing and preemptive applications for approvals that would negate the effect of the legislative changes to which the government has committed. What a slap in the face for our farmers, and doesn't that just illustrate clearly the attitude that this government has for our farmers and the lack of trust in them to do the right thing? These are farmers who have been managing their land, in some cases for generations, who know their land like the back of their hands and who have a vested interest in taking good care of it. QFF and the LGAQ quite rightly called for a RIS process to be undertaken prior to the approval of the bill, to enable a comprehensive understanding of the environmental, social and economic impacts across all Queensland communities. Little to no consideration has been given to the second-order effects that will likely mean that Queensland farmers and graziers will be unable to meet the food and fibre demands of the future. Make no mistake, this bill, if passed today, will deliver a sledgehammer blow to our rural and regional communities. It will cost jobs, and it will impact on the economic prosperity of some of our rural communities at a time when they can least afford it. Mr Deputy Speaker, during the committee hearing process, departmental officers admitted that they had not undertaken any modelling in relation to the effect the proposed legislation will have on agricultural production across the state in the future, and nor did they have any intention of conducting any modelling. During the hearings on the 12th of April 2018, the committee received testimony from Mr Scott Dunlop, a fourth-generation grazier from the Proston district, who articulated his concerns with regard to the potential economic and social impacts of the bill. And here's what he had to say. Has the government done production modelling? We all talk about the work of our country and the rest of the world needing to be fed, housed and clothed. These laws are going to reduce the amount of production that our country can contribute to that. I think that economic modelling is extremely important. I do not think it has been considered at all how this is going to affect individual operations, which in turn is going to affect all communities. This legislation is going to cause a significant downturn in employment and the death of rural communities. Our banks require modelling and budgets from us as business owners, but has the government prepared modelling and budgets to ascertain the extent the negative effects on primary producers, businesses and the subsequent fallout to the communities in which they live? Fair question. Mr Deputy Speaker, it may come as a surprise to those opposite that the LNP is actually committed to environmental protection and laws to ensure land clearing is undertaken in a properly regulated manner, so that biodiversity is protected along with our streams and rivers, and particularly in the catchments of the Great Barrier Reef. We're certainly not advocating wide-scale, unregulated land clearing. Our chief concerns, however, stem from the fact that the Palaszczuk Labor government's approach is not fair to thousands of Queensland farmers who have invested in their land, livestock and farming equipment with the clear expectation of being able to manage their properties, to generate returns, to pay their bills and service borrowing costs, as in any normal business enterprise. These laws, if passed, will have significant impacts on property valuations and, in some cases, place farmers in severe financial difficulty. I have heard first-hand from graziers like Blair and Josie Angus at Kimberley Station, Moranbah, about the impact that these changes will have on their land valuations, not to mention the impact on carrying capacity or earnings capability. Blair and Josie are doing the right thing. They are managing their property in a sustainable and responsible manner with a view to developing it to increase production and profitability. Of course, that is now in jeopardy, and if these laws are passed, they will lose $3.1 million on the valuation of their properties. That's a pretty sobering thought. $3.1 million. That's the real cost of these proposed laws, and you can only imagine what that would equate to if multiplied across Queensland. These concerns are heightened at a time when Queensland needs sustainable growth opportunities, particularly in regional areas which have suffered prolonged drought and loss of employment opportunities. I am particularly concerned that farm management and development projects will be stymied by Labor's proposed bill, which will see further pressure on jobs, particularly in rural areas. There is no question in my mind that under the thin veil of protecting the Great Barrier Reef and reducing Queensland's carbon emissions, this Labor government is introducing vegetation management laws designed to garner inner-city green votes at the next election. Whilst we knew that these laws were drafted behind closed doors in collaboration with the Green groups, the greatest insult has been the farce that was the committee review process. The committee conducted 6 regional hearings in Rockhampton, Townsville, Cloncurry, Longreach, Charleville and Cairns, with more than 1,000 Queenslanders filling venues to have their say on the laws. And I attended some of those hearings, Mr Deputy Speaker, and saw firsthand the frustration and the anger that was evident in those people who were attending. The committee heard first-hand accounts from farmers and industry groups who spoke from the heart and gave evidence believing that the government would take on board this advice and make the necessary changes to the proposed legislation. How wrong they were, Mr Deputy Speaker. It sickens me to say it, but the public hearings were a sham. Despite overwhelming evidence calling for change, the Labor-dominated committee disregarded the more than 1,000 Queenslanders who showed up to the regional hearings, as well as the 13,000 plus who had their say through submissions, by not making a single recommendation to change this legislation before the House. The only recommendations offered by the committee are those that try unsuccessfully to fix the issues these laws create in the first place. Madam Deputy Speaker, the LNP members on the committee submitted a dissenting report for a number of reasons, including, inter alia, the lack of any meaningful consultation with industry groups and the broader community upon whom the laws will directly impact. AgForce described the recommendations the Labor MP submitted from the committee process as an absolute disgrace and a slap in the face for farming families who took the time to have their say and travel vast distances to give evidence. QFF went one step further in condemning the entire parliamentary committee process, saying it had failed farmer, regional communities and the environment. Madam Deputy Speaker, this whole process has clearly shown that the Labor committee members are completely wedded to a political agenda, and their attempt at consultation should be seen for what it was: charade. Whilst the LNP rejects in principle the laws as flawed and unfair, there are a few areas in particular in which the proposed laws completely overstep the mark. One such area is the complete removal of high-value agriculture and irrigated high-value agricultural development approvals. Labor's justification for removing these already heavily regulated clearing provisions from the Act have been ill-informed and inconclusive. For example, IHVA has been a successful policy. It has enabled responsible, small-scale clearing to realise best management practices and positive environmental outcomes. Across all of Queensland, only 5,608 hectares had been approved to be cleared under IHVA since that was brought in between the 2nd of December 2013 to the 5th of February 2018. To put that in context, as a percentage of the total land used for agriculture, that is 0.0039 of 1%. These IHVA clearings delivered incredibly high economic returns and job creation. For example, according to QFF, if those 5,608 hectares that have been approved for IHVA clearing were used in the following industries, the regional economic stimulation and job creation would be as follows: sugarcane, $28 million in additional gross state product, 1,203 direct jobs. The mango industry, $89 million in additional retail value, 617 direct jobs. Bananas, $269 million additional gross value production, 2,243 direct jobs. Macadamia, $73 million in additional wholesale value, 196 on-farm jobs. And of course cotton, $39 million in additional value, 65 on-farm jobs. These are real jobs for Queenslanders. The value these crops produce and the people they employ go a long way in our rural and regional communities. Removing these provisions and only leaving a costly bureaucratic state development application process will stifle agricultural agility and growth in the state, an unacceptable and inequitable outcome. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is our high-value and irrigated high-value agriculture which provides the food and fibre we rely on to feed and clothe us. There's a simple slogan, and we heard it outside at the rally this morning, which sums this up, and that is, no farmers, no food. How true is that? High-value and irrigated high-value agriculture is crucial to Queensland's economy, providing tens of thousands of jobs and revenue for this state. Despite what the Minister has said, these amendments will bring the development of high-value and irrigated high-value agriculture to a halt. It has simply become too difficult. The bureaucracy and the red tape surrounding applications to clear land under the umbrella of HVA and IHVA is such that farmers will simply not bother, and that's a blight on this government and the process that they have implemented. That they would choose to go out of their way to make it more difficult for our farmers to develop their land is nothing short of disgraceful. The justification for removing these successful and sustainable provisions is flawed, and I will be moving amendments in consideration in detail which I believe are practical and more streamlined to address this issue. Madam Deputy Speaker, the proposed expansion of high-value regrowth, Category C, will add an additional layer of regulation under the Vegetation Management Framework on leasehold, freehold and Indigenous land. The inclusion of regrowth that has not been cleared for 15 years will lock up over 862,506 hectares of land as part of this proposed change. This bill will extend the protection of high-value regrowth vegetation to align with high conservation values, and I question that, by amending the definition of high-value regrowth to be vegetation that has not been cleared for 15 years. This creates enormous issues for farmers being able to productively use their land and plan for the future. And when you consider that parts of Queensland have been in the grip of a drought for over 6 years, you start to appreciate that the reduction from 29 to 15 years will have a significant impact on farmers wanting to clear regrowth. As one farmer said to me down here earlier today, when you clear brigalow, it grows back like hairs on a cat's back, and if you don't stay on top of it, you will ultimately lose valuable grazing country. And that's the reality, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our farmers know how to manage their land, and these proposed laws are taking that option away from them. The fact that the government is proposing to lock up previously accessible land without compensation is yet another kick in the guts for our farmers. Our farmers are within their rights to ask that question: will I be compensated for the loss of productive land? I await with bated breath for the Minister's response to that question. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, why shouldn't they be compensated? After all, many of our farmers purchased their properties in good faith and of the understanding that they would be able to develop this land and improve their cash flow and provide a future for their children. In many cases, they have had the rug completely pulled out from beneath them, and in some cases they will be driven to the wall. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to briefly touch on the practice of our farmers in the western areas of the state to clear mulga for the purposes of drought fodder, and I take on board what the Minister said in his response. I know my colleagues from Gregory and Warrego will expand on this practice, but suffice to say the proposed amendments to managing fodder harvesting for drought management will become more cumbersome and ultimately more expensive for our farmers engaged in this practice. These farmers utilise mulga as a source of feed for their stock during times of drought, and the last thing that they need is an extra layer of red tape as part of the approval process. The amendments as proposed will make the clearing of mulga for fodder almost unworkable, which again defies logic, and I will be proposing amendments in line with feedback from farmers and industry groups regarding vegetation clearing for fodder in the mulga lands. Madam Deputy Speaker, last week I had the opportunity to meet with John Fredrickson, a grazier in Moranbah, who expressed his frustration with the proposed amendments regarding managing thickened vegetation. The amendments clearly demonstrate how out of touch this government is when it comes to managing thickened vegetation, or as it is commonly called, tree thinning. This particular grazier was explaining to me how he was required to get on and off his dozer to measure the circumference of trees and the distance between trees to ensure compliance with the legislation. As you would appreciate, constantly getting on and off a dozer with a measuring tape is impractical and unworkable, and this again highlights the lack of thought and common sense around this bill.
Order, members.
Speaker, the proposed inclusion of provisions that facilitate the purposeful creation of administrative and bureaucratic black holes through the development approval process is unacceptable. These costly and time-consuming processes have been deliberately established as a bureaucratic deterrent for farmers who want to manage their vegetation, and should at the very least be limited with administrative due diligence clauses and time limits to ensure the process at least attempts to offer a solution to those who wish to clear their land. It is well and good for the Minister to stand up here today and say there's millions of acres out there available for development, Category X country as he calls it. The reality is the application process for our farmers is a bureaucratic nightmare. I will be moving a deemed approval amendment in consideration in detail around this particular provision. Madam Deputy Speaker, if the provisions within the bill relating to compliance action where unlawful clearing has been undertaken or where there is suspicion it is occurring defies logic. Of particular concern are the provisions giving authorised officers greater powers than Queensland police officers when it comes to the power of entry. The proposed powers will allow these staff to enter a landholder's property without a warrant or the owner's consent if they reasonably believe that a clearing offence has occurred. Can I say, as a former police officer, I have grave concerns at the extent of these powers, and I will be moving amendments relating to this provision during consideration in detail. Ms Wendy Devine from the Queensland Law Society outlined her concerns with this overreach at the Brisbane hearing when she said, "Our concern is that if the trigger for exercising the power of entry is that an officer has a reasonable belief that an offence is happening or is occurring, our question is around the standard of proof that is going to be applied to that. If there is sufficient evidence to indicate that an offence is occurring or has occurred, we query whether the more appropriate method is to take that evidence to a magistrate and obtain a warrant rather than rely on an administrative process of giving 24 hours notice to enter someone's property. Police officers have powers under the Police Powers and Responsibilities Act to conduct investigations into certain offences. Under Section 160 of the PPRA, police do have a power to enter a place without warrant if they believe evidence for a Part 2 offence may be concealed or destroyed unless the place is immediately entered and searched. However, under Section 161, the police officer then has to apply to a magistrate as soon as reasonably practicable after exercising the powers of Section 160 for a post-search approval order to have the entry and any evidence seized authorised as if a warrant was obtained. The Queensland Vegetation Enforcement Unit do not, effectively giving them more powers than our police officers. If this part of the law is to remain, then a similar post-search approval order should be included in the section to have the entry and seizure of any evidence approved by a magistrate. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is very clear that the science these laws are based upon is not settled and in many cases flawed. These laws are based on ideology, not science. Even the government's own scientific advisor, responsible for the satellite mapping technology, said that vegetation regrowth could not be properly mapped and therefore the jury was out on the true rate of vegetation loss. It may come as a surprise to those opposite that after clearing, trees actually do grow back, and in many cases they grow back thicker than the original vegetation. By SLAT's own admission, there's no mapping of regrowth. This legislation has been introduced using SLAT's data, which fails to be based upon science. And can I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have a pretty big electorate, and I can assure you there is a lot of regrowth in Queensland. And when you drive around and you see the extent of the regrowth, you really get an appreciation of just what's coming back in terms of trees right across this state. And I see the member for Gregory nodding his head because he sees it as well when he's driving through his country. To not base this legislation on science fails to tell the whole story on the extent and type of vegetation in Queensland. Madam Deputy Speaker, it defies belief that this minister would come into this place and introduce legislation that has no basis in science, which is not supported by accurate mapping and is clearly reliant on flawed data. I recently visited Bruce Semple's property at Coolabah, Dysart, where he showed me his property maps of accessible vegetation, or PMAP. During my visit, I inspected a stand virgin brigalow comprising approximately 200 acres, which is not showing on his PMAP, and this is despite Bruce making several attempts to have this anomaly rectified. I have heard time and time again from farmers across this state about inaccurate recording of vegetation on satellite imagery, of lantana and woody weeds being shown as remnant vegetation, and particular types of trees being shown in areas where they have never grown. The list of complaints is endless, and I say this to the Minister, your mapping is inaccurate. And until such time as you put departmental staff on the ground to verify the accuracy of your maps, you should not be proceeding with this bill. Madam Deputy Speaker, the total area of Cape York is around 14.5 million hectares, and the total area of land that has been transferred to Aboriginal freeholders is around 5.7 million hectares. And of those 5.7 million hectares, about 2 million is in Cape York Peninsula Aboriginal Land National Park, and about 3.7 million hectares is unencumbered Aboriginal freehold. This land is owned by and is home to about 10,000 Aboriginal people who live in Cape York. Indigenous leaders, especially on Cape York, see these laws as an unfair restriction on the ability to realise the potential of their lands and provide sustainable futures for their people. At the Cairns public hearing, Mr Shannon Burns from the Cape York Land Council Aboriginal Corporation said the amendments to the Vegetation Management Act proposed by this bill would have significant impacts on Aboriginal land on Cape York. The proposed amendments would have the effect that virtually none of the 3.7 million hectares of unencumbered Aboriginal freehold could be cleared for high-value agriculture, even though there are areas that have potential for high-value agriculture, and Aboriginal people have aspirations to use it for that. Mr Gerhard Pearson, Executive Officer, Balcanoe, Cape York Development Corporation, followed by saying we have only just started to sniff and enjoy the piece of dirt under our feet again in this short period, and essentially this law takes that back off us. This pervasive green movement that is very influential, particularly on the Labor Party, provokes down south a snuffling out of the opportunity of remote communities. white and black families on remote communities, and regional Queensland. These are communities that have a long history in providing for the strength of the economy of not just this state, but of this nation. Why would any government, just for votes, in fact arbitrarily take away and limit and devalue the potential for our communities to grow and an economy to grow and for the nation to benefit from that, for our children to benefit from the jobs? The hidden impact of these laws is that our Indigenous Queenslanders, particularly in the Cape, will miss out on economic and employment opportunities from these unfair laws. And if the member for Cook was serious about representing her constituents, she would support the LNP's amendments to this bill. Madam Deputy Speaker, during the course of the hearings, the committee heard evidence from farmers located within the Great Barrier Reef catchment areas. The proposed amendments relating to the extension of Category R to include regrowth vegetation in watercourse and drainage feature areas and 3 additional Great Barrier Reef catchments, namely Eastern Cape York, Fitzroy and Burnett Merry catchments, will have a significant impact on current and future development. Perhaps the Minister could explain how that will work in the sugarcane growing areas around the Burdekin and horticultural areas around Bowen, because I can assure you that I have had no end of calls from concerned farmers about what this will mean for them going forward. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to leave you with the words of one of the witnesses at the public hearings, Mr Guy Newell from Charleville, when he said, "I am opposed to the amendments laid out in this bill. I am opposed to them because there is no evidence that justifies why further amendments to vegetation management in Queensland are necessary." Labor tries to explain why these changes are needed by claiming that increases in tree clearing in Queensland have been alarming and that this needs to be reversed to protect high-value regrowth, remnant ecosystems and the Great Barrier Reef. What they do not tell you, however, is that less than 0.23% of Queensland's land area was cleared in 2015-16 and that 2/3 of this vegetation management was carried out to control regrowth and other routine farm maintenance tasks such as removing invasive weeds, constructing fences, pipelines and roads, thinning, fodder harvesting and managing encroachment. The other thing that the government failed to explain to voters at the last election is that while they can measure changes in tree clearing, they cannot measure changes in regrowth. The government is trying to sell us only one side of the story. Madam Deputy Speaker, the message from our rural and regional communities has been loud and clear. Leave our vegetation management laws alone and stop attacking our farmers. The scaremongering campaign run by this Labor government over tree clearing in this state is nothing short of reprehensible. Our farmers need common-sense laws that work, not overbearing government regulation and red tape that locks up our farmland and holds back regional and rural Queensland. By stopping our farmers from sustainably managing and clearing land, it's inevitable that everyday Queenslanders will be forced to pay more at the checkout for the high-quality, locally grown produce we have come to expect and enjoy. This legislation is about Labor buying green votes in Brisbane and not about the broader well-being of Queensland and its environment and residents. Farmers take great pride in the way they manage their land, and we should trust them to do the right thing instead of demonising them and running interference at every available opportunity. I'm proud to stand here today and say that I support our farmers. I'm proud to say that the LNP, those on this side of the House, will consistently stand up for our hard-working farmers who are being unfairly targeted by a government with no interest in agriculture. We will fight this at every turn, and we will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with our farmers who are the backbone of this state. I ask that this House reject this unfair bill and vote down this attack on our hard-working farmers.
Before